On a cold January night in 2023, Kenneth Fandrick, an ordinary pipe fitter working at Intel, mysteriously vanished at his own workplace. When his wife found the familiar black Honda Civic in the deserted parking garage, Kenneth was sitting quietly in the driver's seat, hands neatly placed on his lap, as if he were sleeping peacefully after a long day of work. But Kenneth would never wake up again. What really happened in the final minutes of his life? Why were dozens of security cameras around the scene systematically covered with blue paint? Who was the masked figure appearing in surveillance footage, moving like a ghost in the darkness? And was this peaceful death actually a meticulously planned crime designed to hide a dark truth? Behind this case lies a story of obsession, years of stalking, and someone who transformed from a respected veterinarian into a dangerous killer. A story that proves no matter how cleverly a crime is concealed, the truth will always be revealed, and justice will ultimately be served. On the cold night of January 27, 2023, the city of Hillsboro, Oregon was shrouded in silence. In a modest home in Oregon City, Tanya Fandrick sat in the kitchen, her worried eyes gazing out the window. The wall clock showed 9:30 in the evening, but Kenneth, her husband who worked as a pipe fitter at the Intel campus, had not yet returned home. Kenneth Fandrick, or Kenny as everyone called him, was a 56-year-old man with a gentle nature and dedication to his work. He worked as a contract pipe installer at Intel Ronler Acres, one of the largest computer chip manufacturing campuses of this tech giant. Usually, Kenny always came home on time, and his prolonged absence made Tanya feel uneasy. In the modern world of location technology, Tanya decided to use the Find My iPhone app to search for her husband. The phone screen displayed a small blue dot, the signal from Kenny's iPhone, still at the Intel campus, specifically in the second-level parking garage. This only heightened her anxiety. Tanya called Kenny repeatedly, but no one answered. The ringtone echoed in the space before switching to voicemail. Each unanswered call felt like a warning bell in her mind. After deliberating, Tanya decided to drive to the Intel campus herself to find out what had happened. The drive from Oregon City to Hillsboro was about 45 minutes. Throughout the journey, Tanya felt a strange uneasiness overwhelming her. Something was wrong, a feeling she couldn't explain. When she reached the Intel campus, she drove straight to the parking garage where the location app indicated Kenny's position. And that's when she saw her husband's familiar black Honda Civic. The car was parked normally in a spot in the parking garage, but something made Tanya feel unsettled. The fluorescent lights from the parking garage's lighting system cast eerie shadows around the concrete pillars. The atmosphere was deserted and quiet to a frightening degree. Tanya approached Kenny's car and tapped lightly on the window. No response. She knocked harder and called her husband's name, but only silence answered. Through the car window, she could see the vague silhouette of a man sitting in the driver's seat, but couldn't clearly see his condition due to the dim light and limited viewing angle. A sense of panic began rising within Tanya. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911 with trembling hands. Her voice shook as she reported to the operator about finding her husband in the car, but that he wasn't responding to any calls. The Hillsboro police team responded to the emergency call quickly. Lieutenant Lynn was the first officer to arrive at the scene. He was a veteran police officer with over 10 years of experience handling various types of emergency situations. However, the scene he witnessed that night would stay with him forever. As he approached the Honda Civic, Lieutenant Lynn saw a man sitting in the driver's seat in what appeared to be a sleeping position. The man's head was tilted down naturally, both hands placed neatly on his thighs. Initially, the officer thought Kenny was simply resting after a long and tiring workday. However, small details made him feel alert. Kenny's head position and the skin color around the neck area showed unusual signs. Lieutenant Lynn, with the experience of a veteran police officer, recognized that something was wrong. The excessive quietness and the perfect posture of the person in the car created an unsettling feeling. He tapped lightly on the car window and called Kenny's name. No response. He knocked harder and even shouted to wake the man in the car. Still only silence replied. At this point, Lieutenant Lin was certain something was wrong. He pulled out his radio and reported to the command center in a serious tone. "Suspected deceased person here. Need immediate assistance." When support units arrived and conducted a more thorough examination, they confirmed that Kenneth Fandrick was no longer alive. However, what was notable was the condition of the body and the surrounding scene. Kenny was found in an overly peaceful and natural position. His hands were placed straight on his thighs, his head tilted down gently as if he were sleeping soundly. There were no obvious signs of struggle, very little blood in the car, and no signs of violence outside. For experienced investigators, this scene immediately raised suspicion. When someone dies from natural causes like a stroke or heart attack, the body usually doesn't maintain such a perfect position. Moreover, Kenny dying exactly at his workplace at the end of his work shift also raised questions that needed answers. While the police team was securing the scene and waiting for investigative specialists, another discovery added to the mystery of the incident. When exploring the area around the parking garage, officers discovered that several security cameras had been systematically vandalized. These cameras had been covered with a thick layer of blue paint, completely obscuring the lenses. What was notable was that this vandalism wasn't random action or simple destruction. The perpetrator had carefully selected which cameras needed to be covered, focusing on angles that could record the area where Kenny usually parked. This discovery immediately transformed the incident from a mysterious death into a serious criminal case. Covering security cameras had only one purpose: to prevent the recording of evidence about a crime about to occur or that had already occurred. The scene was completely sealed off with yellow police tape. Detective Stephanie Winter and Detective Devin Rigo, two veteran investigators from the Hillsborough Police Department, were summoned to the scene. Both had many years of experience handling complex cases, but they admitted they had never encountered a case like this. Detective Winter, with over 15 years of experience in the field, described her initial feeling upon seeing the scene. There was a strange contradiction between the peaceful appearance of the victim and the clear signs of planned sabotage. This could only have one explanation. This was a carefully planned attack, and the perpetrator had tried to create the impression that Kenny died from natural causes. Detective Rigo, Winter's longtime partner, noted that the level of calculation in covering the cameras showed the perpetrator not only had advanced planning, but also knowledge of Intel campus's security system. This raised the question, who could have obtained such information, and why would they want to harm Kenny Fandrick? As the night deepened, the scene remained illuminated by police car spotlights and heavily guarded. Forensic experts and evidence collectors would arrive the next morning to conduct detailed investigative work. But from the very first hours, it was clear this wasn't an ordinary death, but the beginning of a complex case that would shake the local community and leave profound lessons about the dangerous nature of obsession and stalking. The story of Kenneth Fandrick and his mysterious death in the Intel parking garage would gradually be revealed through meticulous police investigation and the persistence of investigators. This was a case that would prove that sometimes the most ordinary-seeming people can hide the darkest secrets. That fateful night, while the crime scene was still being heavily guarded, an important development was taking place at Intel's command center. A patrol officer was present there, in a facility equipped with hundreds of surveillance cameras, monitoring the entire vast campus of this technology company. The images he discovered would become a crucial key to solving the case. The officer began sending short video clips to Detective Rigo via text messages. Each video was like a puzzle piece in the larger picture of what had actually happened in the Intel parking garage. These images, although partially obscured by the vandalism, still revealed shocking details about the level of planning behind the crime. The video showed a man appearing in the parking garage wearing carefully calculated attire. He wore a black mask covering his face, tinted safety glasses covering his eyes, and a yellow hard hat, all items that created a perfect outfit to blend into an industrial environment while completely concealing his identity. The most notable aspect of the video was this person's method of movement. He wasn't a random vandal or an opportunistic thief. On the contrary, Every step he took showed familiarity with the terrain and a pre-planned strategy. He knew exactly where each camera was located, knew their angles, and knew how to approach without being detected from other angles. The camera vandalism process occurred systematically and professionally. The mysterious figure carried a can of blue spray paint and methodically moved from one camera to another. He didn't simply spray paint on the lenses, but also ensured the paint layer was thick enough to completely obscure recording capability. This showed he had thoroughly studied the camera system and knew exactly what needed to be covered. Detailed analysis of the video clips revealed that the vandal had focused on cameras monitoring the area where Kenneth Fandrick usually parked his car. This couldn't be coincidence. He knew exactly where Kenny would park, knew his work schedule, and had planned to ensure his actions wouldn't be recorded. Another important detail discovered in the video was the timing of these actions. The camera vandalism occurred early in the morning, many hours before Kenny finished his work shift. This proved the attacker knew Kenny's schedule in advance and had sufficient time to prepare. Fortunately, however, not all cameras were completely obscured. A few angles still captured dim images before being painted over. In those precious moments, the cameras recorded an important detail: the moment the actual attack occurred. Around 5:15 in the afternoon, when Kenny left the Intel building to go home, a maroon minivan appeared in the parking garage. This vehicle parked right next to Kenny's Honda Civic in a way too perfect to be coincidence. The video showed movement between the two vehicles around 5:45, exactly when Kenny would have reached his car. Notably, during those moments, the cameras captured strange flashing lights from the area between the two vehicles. Video analysis experts later determined these lights could have been the result of a struggle, possibly from flashlights or phone lights being turned on and off during physical conflict. At 6:15 in the evening, the maroon minivan left the parking garage. The video showed the vehicle moving calmly, without haste, as if the driver was trying to avoid attracting attention. This was a sign of an experienced criminal who knew how to control their behavior even in tense situations. Meanwhile, at the mobile command post established at the scene, Detective Winter and Detective Rigo began their first interview with Tanya Fandrick. This conversation would open a completely new aspect of the case and reveal the motive behind this horrific crime. Tanya, though still in shock after losing her husband, tried to provide detailed information to the investigators. Through tears, she spoke about her marriage to Kenneth and revealed information that would completely change the direction of the investigation. She disclosed that Kenneth had a stalker for many years, a man named Steven Milner. Milner wasn't a stranger or an ordinary criminal. On the contrary, he was a wealthy and respected veterinarian in the Oregon City community. This contrast between social status and stalking behavior surprised the investigators. Tanya told detailed stories about the complicated relationship she had with Steven Milner. She had worked for Milner at his veterinary clinic for over 20 years, since she was young. Throughout that long period, she had become a trusted and important employee in running the clinic. However, this working relationship had gradually developed into a more complex personal relationship. For a period of time, Tanya and Steven Milner had an extramarital affair. This was a decision Tanya always regretted later and described as a major mistake in her life. When Kenneth discovered this relationship, he confronted his wife directly, but without violence. This difficult conversation led to Tanya's decision to completely end the relationship with Steven Milner and focus on repairing her marriage. However, Steven Milner did not accept this decision easily. Instead, he began a prolonged campaign of harassment and stalking, gradually escalating from constant phone calls to more serious invasive behaviors. Tanya described the frightening transformation in Steven Milner's personality after she ended the relationship. The man she once knew as a kind veterinarian who cared for animals had become an obsessive and threatening figure. He began calling her constantly, appearing unexpectedly at places she frequented, and even following her home. More concerning was that Steven Milner had shifted his attention from Tanya to Kenneth. He seemed to have decided that Kenneth was the main reason preventing him from reuniting with Tanya. From then on, Kenneth became the primary target of harassment and threatening behaviors. The investigators delved deeper into this stalking history and discovered a disturbing behavioral pattern. Steven Milner had used many sophisticated methods to monitor and harass the Fandrick couple. He had installed multiple GPS tracking devices on their vehicles, allowing him to monitor all their movements without needing to be physically present. The invasive behavior didn't stop at remote surveillance. Milner had repeatedly trespassed on the Fandrick property at night. He climbed fences, hid in shadows, and even installed monitoring devices around their house. These actions created a constant feeling of being watched and fear in Kenneth and Tanya's daily lives. The climax of the threatening behaviors was the direct violent threats Steven Milner made against Kenneth. As a former surgeon, Milner used his professional knowledge to create particularly frightening threats. He told Kenneth that he had the tools and knowledge to cut him into small pieces. These threats weren't impulsive statements made in anger, but calculated declarations repeated multiple times. They showed the level of obsession and real danger Steven Milner posed to Kenneth Fandrick. The situation became serious enough that Kenneth decided to seek legal protection. In March 2022, after months of enduring harassment, Kenneth filed for a stalking protective order against Steven Milner. This was an important step in documenting illegal behaviors and seeking intervention from the legal system. The stalking protective order was approved by the court, prohibiting Steven Milner from approaching or contacting Kenneth and Tanya Fandrick. However, like many other cases, a piece of legal paper couldn't stop a determined, obsessed individual. Milner continued to violate this protective order systematically and boldly. Police investigation revealed that immediately after the protective order was issued, Steven Milner became more sophisticated in his stalking behaviors. Instead of direct approaches, he used remote surveillance methods and technology to continue monitoring the Fandrick couple without being easily detected. One of the clearest pieces of evidence of protective order violation was in March 2022, just a few weeks after the order was issued. Steven Milner had followed Kenneth from Oregon City to Hillsborough, a journey lasting 45 minutes. Kenneth discovered he was being followed and called police to report it. The traffic stop by Hillsborough police was recorded by officers' body cameras. This video later became important evidence showing Steven Milner's level of obsession and the irrationality of his arguments. In the video, when asked about his reason for following Kenneth, Steven Milner gave a strange and concerning explanation. He claimed he was trying to protect Tanya by monitoring Kenneth. He believed Kenneth was threatening Tanya and that he had a responsibility to intervene to protect her. This argument showed a frightening level of delusion in Steven Milner's psychology. He had convinced himself that he was the hero in this story, someone trying to save Tanya from a problematic marriage. In reality, this was a common form of rationalization in stalker psychology, where they transform their illegal behavior into righteous action. The police officer gave Steven Milner a stern warning, demanding he cease all forms of contact with the Fandrick couple. However, as subsequent events proved, this warning had no effect in stopping Milner's dangerous behavior. The warning from Hillsborough police in March 2022 failed to deter Steven Milner. On the contrary, it seemed to push him to become more sophisticated and dangerous in his stalking behaviors. 2 weeks after the traffic stop, Kenneth Fandrick experienced a car accident that he attributed to stress from being constantly followed. In police body camera footage recorded on March 28th, Kenneth was seen in an obviously stressed and exhausted state. He told the officer that he and his wife had been fighting, and while driving, he lost control and had an accident. This was clear evidence of the serious psychological impact that stalking behaviors had on Kenneth's life. Michael Fuller, Kenneth's attorney, described his client during this period as a man living in constant fear. The stalking issue had become the center of Kenneth's life, affecting his work, family relationships, and mental health. Attorney Fuller noted that Kenneth was absolutely terrified and felt like his life was being controlled by a stranger. During this time, Steven Milner continued to escalate his harassment behaviors. He became more brazen, appearing at the Fandrick home at night, climbing over their property fence, and installing additional tracking devices. Tanya provided police with one of the GPS tracking devices she discovered, important physical evidence of the level of invasion they had endured. The situation became more serious in August 2022, when Kenneth discovered another tracking device installed under his car. This time, police had enough evidence to charge Steven Milner with violating the protective order. He was arrested and had to await trial on criminal charges. However, instead of calming the situation, being criminally charged seemed to make Steven Milner more desperate and dangerous. He realized that the legal system was gradually narrowing his operating space, and this may have pushed him toward more extreme actions. Just 1 month after being charged, Kenneth decided to file a civil lawsuit against Steven Milner. The lawsuit demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation for invasion of privacy and infliction of emotional distress. In court records, Kenneth described in detail the psychological campaign Milner had conducted to threaten, intimidate, frighten, and harass him. This civil lawsuit created additional legal pressure on Steven Milner, as he now faced both criminal charges and the possibility of paying substantial civil damages. For someone with an obsessive personality like Milner, feeling surrounded from all sides may have created a dangerous psychological situation. While legal proceedings were ongoing, Steven Milner began taking steps to prepare for a darker plan. In October 2022, he purchased a car through the Craigslist website. This car purchase wasn't to replace an old vehicle, but to create the ability to track Kenneth more secretly. The car was purchased with cash and registered under information unrelated to Milner, creating a layer of concealment for stalking activities. This was the first sign of Milner moving to use what investigators later called burner cars, vehicles purchased for illegal purposes and then discarded. 2 months later, in December 2022, Intel's security camera system captured a disturbing image. Steven Milner had appeared in the Intel campus parking garage in disguise. He wore a mask, sunglasses, and hard hat, creating the image of an ordinary construction worker, but actually to conceal his identity. During this reconnaissance, Milner performed a frightening test action. He used spray paint to cover some security cameras, including those monitoring the area where Kenneth usually parked. This wasn't a random act of vandalism, but a test to assess Intel's security system response. This test showed that Milner had spent time thoroughly researching the parking garage layout, camera positions, security team response times, and the ability to obscure surveillance devices. This was clear evidence of a plan being prepared systematically and thoughtfully. In the following weeks, Steven Milner appeared multiple times at the Intel parking garage to observe Kenneth's activity patterns. He memorized Kenneth's work schedule, the times he arrived and left the company, and even small variations in daily routines. In January 2023, Milner took the final preparatory step for his plan. He purchased another vehicle, this time a maroon minivan, and once again used a fake identity. The car seller later remembered that the buyer had used Milner's phone number but introduced himself with the name Jerry Lee. Having 2 burner cars allowed Milner to execute a complex plan without being easily detected. He could use one vehicle for preparatory activities, then switch to the other for the main action, creating difficulty for later tracking. While Steven Milner was preparing his dark plan, Kenneth Fandrick was still trying to live a normal life despite facing constant threats. He continued working at Intel, tried to maintain his relationship with his wife, and hoped that the legal system would eventually protect him. However, on January 27, 2023, all of Kenneth's efforts to seek protection and justice became futile. Steven Milner decided to execute the plan he had been preparing for months. On that fateful morning, Milner used the Buick sedan, one of the burner cars, to go to Intel campus. He wore complete disguise clothing with a black mask, tinted safety glasses, and yellow hard hat. This outfit not only concealed his identity, but also helped him blend into Intel campus's industrial environment. From 7:45 to 8:15 in the morning, Milner systematically vandalized security cameras. He moved from camera to camera, using blue spray paint, to completely obscure the lenses. Every movement was precise and purposeful, showing he had thoroughly rehearsed. After completing the camera covering, Milner left the parking garage and returned in the afternoon with the maroon minivan. He parked right next to the spot where he knew Kenneth would park, creating a perfect trap. In the minivan, Steven Milner sat waiting. These could have been the final minutes when he could still change his mind, turn around, and drive away, ending the chain of dangerous behavior. However, obsession and hatred had pushed him too far to turn back. When Kenneth Fandrick stepped out of the Intel building at 5:35 in the afternoon to end a normal workday, he had no idea that the person who had stalked him for years was waiting just a few meters from his car. Kenneth walked toward his familiar black Honda Civic, possibly thinking about going home to his wife and plans for the evening. As Kenneth approached his car and unlocked it, Steven Milner exited the minivan and approached from behind. What happened next was partially recorded on camera video, although the images were obscured by paint Milner had sprayed on the lenses. However, flashing lights and movement showed that a confrontation had occurred. According to later autopsy results, Kenneth was attacked from behind and strangled to death. The attack occurred quickly and efficiently, showing Milner may have planned the execution method in detail. Kenneth, with his smaller build and being unprepared for the attack, had no opportunity for self-defense. After Kenneth stopped resisting, Steven Milner executed the final part of his plan, staging the scene. He carefully moved Kenneth's body into the car, placing him in the driver's seat in a position that looked as if he had died of natural causes. Kenneth's hands were placed neatly on his thighs, his head tilted down naturally. Milner also rearranged Kenneth's personal belongings in the car to create a sense of normalcy. The phone, wallet, and other objects were all placed in reasonable positions. The purpose of this staging was to create the impression that Kenneth had died of a heart attack or stroke while sitting in his car after a tiring workday. The scene staging showed that Milner had studied forensics and understood how police investigate unusual deaths. He hoped that creating a natural death scene would prevent police from conducting a deep investigation, and he would escape the consequences of his actions. After completing the staging, Steven Milner left the parking garage in the minivan around 6:15 in the evening. The video showed him driving calmly, without haste, continuing to maintain the image of a normal person to avoid attracting attention. In the hours that followed, when Kenneth didn't come home as usual, Tanya began worrying and eventually went to search for her husband. The discovery of Kenneth's body and the 911 call initiated an investigation that would gradually reveal the truth about this meticulously planned crime. But Steven Milner had underestimated the capabilities of modern police and the persistence of investigators like Detective Winter and Detective Rigo. The evidence he thought was concealed or destroyed would gradually be recovered and analyzed, leading to his arrest and prosecution. After Steven Milner left the crime scene, he carried out the final steps in his plan to cover up the crime. The maroon minivan, the actual scene where Kenneth's life was taken, had become Milner's primary concern. He knew that inside this vehicle there could be forensic evidence that might convict him. Just a few days after the attack, the minivan was discovered abandoned on the side of Interstate 5 in North Portland. Abandoning the vehicle at such a location wasn't random. This was a high-traffic area where an abandoned car would quickly be discovered and towed by highway patrol. The Oregon Department of Transportation sent the first alert about the abandoned minivan. Following standard procedure, the vehicle was towed to an impound lot and then sold to a scrap metal company. This was exactly what Steven Milner wanted. He hoped the most important evidence would be crushed and disappear forever. However, Milner hadn't counted on the persistence and investigative talent of Detective Devin Rigo. When he received information about the minivan from ODOT's alert system, Detective Rigo immediately recognized the importance of this evidence. He contacted the towing company and received disturbing news. The minivan had been sold to a scrap company and was being prepared for crushing. A race against time began. Detective Rigo knew that if the minivan was crushed, they would lose forensic evidence that could decide the entire case. He drove at high speed to the scrapyard north of Portland, hoping there was still time to save the vehicle. Unfortunately, when Detective Rigo arrived at the scrapyard, he was too late. The scrapyard employee showed him video footage of the minivan, which he was certain was the primary crime scene, being crushed into metal fragments before his eyes. This was one of the most painful moments in his investigative career. Detective Rigo later described that feeling. "I watched one of my most important pieces of evidence get crushed before my eyes, exactly 1 week too late." Losing the minivan created a major challenge for prosecution, but it didn't discourage the investigation team. Meanwhile, the investigation had shifted focus to Steven Milner as the primary suspect. With information from Tanya and legal records about stalking behaviors, Detective Winter and Detective Rigo began building a comprehensive picture of Milner's life and character. Steven Neil Milner, 58 years old, was a retired veterinarian with over 20 years of experience. He operated a successful veterinary clinic in Oregon City and was respected by the local community. His longtime clients described Milner as a kind person who cared for animals and was dedicated to his profession. Cheryl Choquette and Darlene Robinson, two loyal clients of Milner for many years, couldn't believe the news about the allegations. They remembered Milner as a wonderful veterinarian who was compassionate, caring, and kind. Choquette had even participated in a promotional video for Milner's clinic that aired on local television. The contrast between Milner's public image and actual behavior created a phenomenon that forensic psychologists call a mask of sanity. This is the ability of some individuals to maintain a normal appearance in society while concealing abnormal behaviors and thoughts. Financial investigation revealed that Milner had considerable assets, estimated at several $1,000,000, from running his veterinary practice and real estate investments. He lived alone in a large house in Oregon City after his divorce, and seemed to have sufficient time and resources to carry out complex stalking behaviors. On January 31st, 2023, just 4 days after Kenneth was found dead, police had enough evidence to obtain arrest and search warrants. A task force including Detective Winter, Detective Rigo, and many other officers surrounded Milner's house in Clackamas County early in the morning. The arrest scene unfolded surprisingly quietly. Milner didn't resist and seemed to have mentally prepared for this moment. When officers appeared at his door with arrest warrants, he simply said, "I need a lawyer," and surrendered calmly. However, the search of Milner's house revealed disturbing details about his level of obsession. In the master bedroom, investigators discovered a cardboard cutout with Milner's face pasted onto the image of a muscular man with a dog paw tattoo on his chest. This was a form of fantasy projection showing how Milner saw himself. Even more concerning was the discovery in the nightstand drawer, a shrine dedicated to Tanya Fandrick. This collection included dozens of photos of Tanya, some taken secretly from a distance, personal items he may have obtained from the clinic or other sources, and even detailed notes about her daily schedule. In the garage and other areas of the house, police found many unused GPS tracking devices, fake license plates, sunglasses, and hard hats similar to those seen in Intel surveillance video. Notably, Milner's computer contained hundreds of secretly taken photos of Kenneth and Tanya at various locations, from their home to workplace. Another important discovery was tracking software that Milner had installed on his computer to monitor GPS devices. This software allowed him to monitor the Fandrick couple's movements in real time, creating a comprehensive and invasive surveillance system. While the search was ongoing, the forensic lab worked tirelessly to analyze samples collected from the crime scene and Kenneth's body. This process required absolute care and precision, as the results could determine the success or failure of the case. The breakthrough moment came one afternoon when Detective Rigo received an email from the lab. DNA analysis results from samples taken from Kenneth Fandrick's hands showed a match with Steven Milner's DNA. This was the decisive forensic evidence investigators had hoped for. Detective Rigo described that moment. "I remember receiving the email with results and immediately opening it, thinking, oh my gosh, this is it. Steven Milner's DNA was on Kenneth Fandrick's hands. He emphasized the importance of this discovery. There's no way he could explain why his DNA would be on Kenneth's body. This DNA evidence provided a direct physical link between Steven Milner and the victim at the time the crime occurred. With an error probability of only about 1 in several billion, this was irrefutable evidence that Milner had physical contact with Kenneth during his attack. Other supporting evidence was also accumulating. GPS analysis from Milner's personal vehicle showed he had been at important locations at crucial times. Specifically, the data showed Milner's car had appeared multiple times at the Home Depot parking lot in Oregon City, where surveillance video later confirmed he had used as a hub to switch between vehicles. Video from Home Depot showed Milner moving back and forth between 3 different cars over several days. This imagery clearly illustrated the burner cars system he had established to carry out stalking activities and ultimately the crime without being detected. The analyzed activity pattern showed Milner had used his personal car to get to Home Depot, switched to the Buick sedan in the morning to carry out camera covering, then returned to switch to the minivan in the afternoon for the attack. After completing the crime, he had returned to get his personal car and left the area. Identifying the person who sold the minivan to Milner provided additional important evidence. The seller remembered that the buyer had used Milner's phone number, but given the fake name, Jerry Lee. This showed Milner was conscious about concealing his identity in transactions related to the crime. The investigation also revealed that Milner had thoroughly researched Kenneth's schedule and habits. He knew exactly when Kenneth started and ended his work shifts, knew where he usually parked, and even small variations in daily routines. This thorough preparation showed this wasn't an impulsive action or crime of passion, but the result of a plan nurtured and developed over months. Milner had spent considerable time studying the target, environment, and timing to maximize success potential and minimize risk of detection. With sufficient evidence accumulated, prosecutors John Gerhard and Mahalie Streblow began preparing the prosecution case. They faced the challenge of proving beyond reasonable doubt without the smoking gun of the destroyed minivan. However, the combination of DNA evidence, video surveillance, GPS tracking data, and pattern of stalking behavior created a solid case. The prosecution strategy would be to build a comprehensive story about obsession, planning, execution, and cover-up attempt. Prosecutor Gerhard noted, "Although we lost all evidence inside the van, this is our biggest disappointment because there could have been a lot of forensic evidence." However, he was confident that the remaining evidence was strong enough to ensure conviction. Milner's defense team, led by attorney Amanda T. Bold, would face a major challenge. With overwhelming evidence pointing toward their client, the only viable strategy might be a self-defense claim or temporary insanity plea. When news of Steven Milner's arrest spread through the Oregon City community, the reaction was shock and disbelief. Many people who had known Milner for years as a caring professional and respected community member couldn't reconcile that image with the serious allegations. Darlene Robinson, one of the longtime clients, expressed confusion. "I couldn't believe it was the same person. I think he went through some type of psychosis, and I think at some point he snapped." Steven Milner's story became a case study about how people can hide dark impulses and dangerous obsessions behind a facade of respectability and professional success. This was a frightening reminder that you never know what anybody is capable of, and you never know what monster might be inside. With Steven Milner now in custody and awaiting trial, the stage was set for a courtroom drama that would capture national attention and test the strength of the justice system in dealing with crimes of obsession and stalking. 2 years after Kenneth Fandrick's tragic death, on January 13, 2025, Steven Neil Milner finally went to trial at Washington County Circuit Court. The trial took place before Judge Eric Bucher, a judge with many years of experience handling serious criminal cases. This was the moment Kenneth's family and the community had waited for to see justice served. The prosecution team included Senior Deputy District Attorney John Gerhard and Deputy District Attorney Mahalie Streblow, 2 veteran prosecutors with impressive track records in handling violent crimes. They had spent months preparing for this trial, knowing it would be one of the most complex and high-profile cases of their careers. On the defense side, Steven Milner was represented by attorney Amanda Thibault and an experienced defense team. They faced an enormous challenge: how to create reasonable doubt in a case with overwhelming evidence pointing toward their client. In his opening statement, Prosecutor Gerhardt painted a dark picture of obsession and premeditated murder. He described Steven Milner as a man who had become consumed by losing Tanya and had decided that Kenneth was the only obstacle preventing him from reclaiming the life he thought he deserved. "This is a story about a man who couldn't accept no for an answer," Gerhardt told the jury. "A man who used his intelligence, his resources, and his professional knowledge to stalk, terrorize, and ultimately eliminate Kenneth Fandrick." Defense attorney Thibault, in her opening, attempted to humanize Milner and create sympathy. She portrayed him as a heartbroken and confused man, someone who had lost his way after his relationship with Tanya ended. She suggested that Milner's actions, while wrong, stemmed from genuine concern for Tanya's safety, rather than malicious intent. The prosecution began their case by establishing the foundation of the relationships between the parties involved. Tanya Fandrick, who had survived this nightmare, took the stand as the first witness. With admirable courage, she recounted painful details about her affair with Milner and the subsequent stalking campaign. Tanya's testimony revealed the depth of Milner's obsession. She described how he had transformed from a caring employer into a menacing and unpredictable presence in her life. She spoke about countless phone calls, unexpected appearances, and gradually escalating threats that made daily life a nightmare. "He made me feel like I was constantly being watched," Tanya testified, her voice breaking with emotion. "I couldn't go anywhere without wondering if he was following me. It wasn't just harassment. It was psychological torture." The prosecution then presented extensive evidence of Milner's stalking behavior. Multiple police reports were read into the record, documenting years of harassment and violations of protective orders. Officers testified about encounters with Milner, including dramatic body camera footage from the traffic stop when he had been caught following Kenneth. This video was particularly damaging to the defense. It showed Milner admitting to following Kenneth and providing bizarre justification about protecting Tanya. The audio quality was excellent, allowing the jury to hear Milner's own words explaining his behavior. Detective Stephanie Winter and Detective Devin Rigo provided detailed testimony about their investigation. They walked the jury through the discovery process, from initial crime scene assessment to gradual accumulation of evidence pointing to Milner. Their professional demeanor and thorough preparation were impressive, lending credibility to the prosecution's case. One of the most compelling moments of the trial was when Detective Rigo testified about the DNA evidence. Using charts and visual aids, the forensic expert explained the probability of the DNA match and impossibility of contamination or coincidental transfer. The numbers were staggering. Odds against this being coincidental were 1 in several billion. This DNA evidence tells us beyond any doubt that Steven Milner had physical contact with Kenneth Fandrick at the time of death, the expert testified. There's no innocent explanation for this evidence. Video surveillance evidence was also powerful. Although cameras had been partially obscured by paint, technical experts were able to enhance remaining footage and provide a clear timeline of events. The jury watched the masked figure methodically disabling cameras, then saw the minivan arriving and departing from the crime scene. Particularly dramatic was the moment when the prosecution showed a side-by-side comparison of Milner's build and movements with those of the masked figure in the video. While not definitively conclusive alone, combined with other evidence, it painted a compelling picture. GPS evidence from Milner's personal vehicle provided another layer of proof. The prosecution showed detailed maps tracking Milner's movements before and after the murder, including multiple trips to Intel campus and the Home Depot parking lot used as a staging area. The defense team attempted to challenge evidence on several fronts. They questioned the reliability of surveillance video, pointing out obscured images and possibility of mistaken identification. They raised questions about DNA transfer, suggesting innocent explanations for the presence of Milner's genetic material on Kenneth's hands. Thibault also attempted to introduce evidence about Kenneth's alleged history of domestic issues, trying to suggest alternative motives and suspects. However, Judge Boucher limited this line of questioning, ruling it more prejudicial than probative. The centerpiece of the defense strategy was the decision to have Milner testify in his own defense. This was an extremely risky move, as it exposed him to cross-examination by experienced prosecutors. However, faced with overwhelming evidence, the defense team felt it was their only chance to create reasonable doubt. Milner's testimony was one of the most bizarre aspects of the entire trial. Speaking in a soft voice and often asking for questions to be repeated, he attempted to portray himself as a confused and well-meaning individual who had simply tried to help Tanya. He admitted to spray painting cameras and waiting in the Intel garage, but claimed his purpose was to catch Kenneth drinking and driving so he could have him arrested and protect Tanya from her dangerous husband. This explanation struck many observers as a desperate attempt to rationalize clearly criminal behavior. When describing the actual confrontation with Kenneth, Milner claimed self-defense. He testified that Kenneth had attacked him first upon discovering Milner hidden in the minivan. According to Milner's version, a struggle ensued in which Kenneth accidentally struck his head against the car door, resulting in the fatal neck injury. "I was able to push him against the car," Milner testified. "He tripped at the same time and I kept pushing. I didn't mean for anything like this to happen." Cross-examination by prosecutor Gerhardt was devastating. With surgical precision, he dismantled Milner's story piece by piece. He pointed out inconsistencies with physical evidence, the impossibility of accidental neck break from a minor head bump, and lack of defensive wounds on Kenneth's body. Gerhardt also challenged Milner's claimed motivation, asking pointed questions about extensive surveillance equipment, fake identities used to purchase vehicles, and months of planning evident in the evidence. "If you were simply concerned about Kenneth's drinking," Gerhardt asked, "why didn't you call police instead of setting up an elaborate surveillance operation?" The medical examiner's testimony had already established that Kenneth's injuries were consistent with a chokehold, not accidental trauma. The pathologist explained that the type of neck fracture found in Kenneth's body required significant, sustained pressure, not a bump against a car door. "To my knowledge," the medical examiner testified, "bumping your head on a car door is not going to break your neck. These injuries are consistent with manual strangulation by someone with considerable strength and knowledge of human anatomy." As the trial progressed, the defense's credibility continued to deteriorate. Evidence about Milner's shrine to Tanya, extensive stalking equipment, and calculated planning made the self-defense claim increasingly implausible. The jury could see the disparity between Milner's claimed innocent intentions and the sophisticated criminal operation he had constructed. Closing arguments provided the final opportunity for both sides to make their case. Prosecutor Streblow delivered a passionate summation, emphasizing the pattern of escalating violence and tragedy of Kenneth's death. "Kenneth Fandrick did everything right," she told the jury. "He followed proper legal channels, obtained protective orders, sought help from police. But Steven Milner refused to accept boundaries set by law and society. His obsession drove him to plan and execute a cold-blooded crime." The defense's closing focused on reasonable doubt and possibility of accident or self-defense. Thibault argued that the prosecution had not proven intent to commit murder, suggesting that the confrontation had escalated beyond Milner's original intentions. However, facing overwhelming evidence of premeditation, from camera tampering to fake vehicle purchases to GPS tracking, defense arguments rang hollow. The jury could see that this was not a crime of passion, but a carefully orchestrated plan executed over months. After receiving instructions from Judge Boucher, the jury retired to deliberate. They faced a decision between second-degree murder, manslaughter, or acquittal based on the self-defense claim. The weight of evidence was substantial, but the legal standard required proof beyond reasonable doubt. 6 hours later, the jury returned with their verdict. Tension in the courtroom was palpable as the foreman stood to read the decision. "We, the jury, find defendant Steven Neil Milner guilty of murder in the second degree." Additional convictions followed, guilty of stalking and 7 counts of violating a protective order. Each verdict struck like a hammer blow, confirming that the justice system had recognized the full scope of Milner's criminal behavior. The courtroom reaction was intense. Tanya Fandrick collapsed in tears of relief and grief. Family members and friends of Kenneth embraced each other, finally seeing some measure of justice for their lost loved one. Milner showed no visible emotion, sitting quietly with hands folded as the verdicts were read. A sentencing hearing was scheduled for February 18th, providing time for victim impact statements and sentencing recommendations. This would be the final chapter in legal proceedings, the moment when society would formally condemn Milner's actions and determine his punishment. The following month, the courtroom was packed for the sentencing hearing. Cameras were allowed for the first time, reflecting public interest in the case conclusion. The most powerful moment came when Tanya Fandrick delivered her victim impact statement. 20 minutes of raw emotion and devastating condemnation. "All you had to do was stop," she said, her voice filled with pain and anger. "You are a vengeful, deceptive, manipulating, self-serving, aggressive, hateful, lying predator. All you had to do was stop." Her words captured not just personal devastation, but the broader failure of the system to protect stalking victims. Despite protective orders, police warnings, and legal action, Kenneth had ultimately paid with his life for Steven Milner's obsession. Prosecutor Gerhardt recommended the maximum sentence, calling Milner a deranged individual whose predatory behavior warrants this court assuring that he dies behind bars. He emphasized the pattern of escalating violence and danger Milner would continue to pose if ever released. The defense requested mercy, pointing to Milner's previously clean record and contributions to the community as a veterinarian. However, these arguments carried little weight against overwhelming evidence of calculated cruelty and total disregard for human life. Judge Bouquet delivered the sentence with gravity appropriate to the crime's severity. Life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 25 years. Additionally, if parole was ever granted, Milner would serve an additional 6 years of supervision. This court finds the defendant's actions represent the worst form of domestic terrorism, the judge stated. Through systematic stalking, harassment, and ultimately premeditated violence, you destroyed not just Kenneth Fandrick's life, but devastated an entire family and community. With sentencing complete, the legal chapter in Kenneth Fandrick's story finally closed. However, broader issues raised by the case continued to resonate. Civil litigation remained pending, with Kenneth's estate seeking substantial damages from Milner's estimated multi-million-dollar assets. November 2025 brought final resolution when a settlement agreement was reached. Milner agreed to pay $1.2 million, $700,000 from personal assets, and $500,000 from insurance coverage. While significantly less than the $10 million originally sought, the settlement provided some financial security for Tanya and closure to the prolonged legal process. Attorney Michael Fuller, representing Kenneth's estate, called the settlement the end of the most bizarre and tragic case of his career. Money could never replace Kenneth or heal the trauma inflicted, but it provided resources for Tanya to rebuild her life and perhaps help other stalking victims. The case attracted national attention, including a feature on CBS's 48 Hours documentary program titled Murder in the Parking Garage. The broadcast helped raise awareness about stalking dangers and the importance of taking such threats seriously. For investigating detectives Winter and Rigo, the case represented a career-defining moment. Their thorough work and persistence in the face of challenging evidence collection had ensured justice for Kenneth Fandrick. Both emphasized the importance of believing victims and taking stalking reports seriously from the first incident. The broader impact of the case extended beyond individual justice. It highlighted gaps in stalking protection laws and enforcement mechanisms. Despite multiple protective orders and police contact, the system had failed to prevent escalation to murder. Victim advocates used the case to push for stronger stalking legislation in Oregon and improved training for law enforcement officers. They emphasized the need for more aggressive intervention when protective orders are violated and better coordination between civil and criminal systems. The case also demonstrated evolution in investigative techniques, particularly the use of GPS data, enhanced video analysis, and DNA evidence in complex prosecutions. Technical advances had provided crucial evidence that might not have been available in earlier decades. Perhaps most importantly, Kenneth Fandrick's story served as a powerful reminder about the real human cost of obsessive behavior and the importance of recognizing warning signs before escalation to violence. His legacy would continue in efforts to protect other potential victims from similar fates. For Tanya Fandrick, moving forward meant living with permanent scars in the aftermath of the traumatic experience. However, her courage in testifying and speaking out had helped ensure justice and might prevent similar tragedies. Her final words to Milner, "All you had to do was stop," became a rallying cry for stalking awareness campaigns. Steven Milner began serving his life sentence in Oregon State Prison. His transformation from respected veterinarian to convicted individual, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beneath facades of respectability. His case would be studied by criminologists and mental health professionals seeking to understand the psychology of stalkers and predictors of violent escalation. In the end, the justice system had worked, but at terrible cost. Kenneth Fandrick's death could have been prevented if warnings had been heeded sooner and intervention had been more aggressive. His story stands as a testament to both the triumph of justice and the tragic consequences when obsession goes unchecked, reminding us all that behind ordinary facades can lie extraordinary dangers.